New Orleans, and yes, the people that live there generally pronounce that as one word and not two, is a city known for its unique architecture, for its unique music, for its unique dialects, and for its festivals, including Mardi Gras. But FrenchQuarter.com notes that looking today at the vibrant festive quarter with millions of visitors annually, it is difficult to imagine the devastation of Holy Saturday morning, 1788. Smoking ruins stretch from Chartres to Dauphine Street, from Conti to St. Philip. The 1788 Great Fire of New Orleans deserves to be remembered. In April 1682, French explorer René Robert Cavelier, having traveled from Niagara all the way down the Mississippi River, named the river basin Louisiana after King Louis XIV and claimed it for France. The new territory was huge, originally covering most of the drainage basin of the Mississippi River, stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Appalachian Mountains to the Rocky Mountains. In 1684, Cavelier requested a charter with the intent of founding a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi, and the French Mississippi Company was created. The company had the support of France largely because France, cash-strapped from fighting wars, was selling land in the vast new territory. Cavalier's colony failed, but 34 years later, in 1718, the administrator of the Mississippi Company, Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne, discovered what he described as a crescent bend in the Mississippi River that he felt was safe from tidal surges and hurricanes, and proposed that the capital of Louisiana be moved from Mobile to there, founding a new city that he called Nouvelle Orleans, named in honor of the regent of France, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans. At the time, the French counted less than 800 Europeans in Louisiana Territory. Pierre-François Xavier de Charlevoix, a Jesuit priest and explorer considered to be the first historian of New France, said of Nouvelle Orleans, "The city was the first that one of the greatest rivers of the world has seen rise on its banks." But the new city and territory struggled. The scheme of selling land in Louisiana had created a bubble, which collapsed and nearly bankrupted the crown, and the city lost much of its colonial support. In his journal in 1721, de Charlevoix described the city as a place of 100 wretched hovels in a malarious wet thicket of willows and dwarfed palmettos, infested by serpents and alligators. Many of these hovels were then blown down in a hurricane in 1722. The grid pattern upon which the city was rebuilt is still obvious in the city today. Still, Charlevoix understood what the city would become. In his 1744 History and General Description of New France, he wrote, "What a pleasure to see this future capital of a beautiful and vast country grow indescribably. This washed and barren space, which the canes and the trees still cover almost entirely, will one day make, and perhaps that day is not so far off, an opulent city, and the metropolis of a great and rich colony." Oddly, a good deal of the growth of that metropolis would not be under the French. In 1763, after the British victory in the 7 Years' War, Britain claimed essentially all of North America east of the Mississippi River. France traded Louisiana, including New Orleans, to the Spanish Empire, ostensibly in exchange for Britain claiming Spanish Florida. The city continued to grow under Spanish rule. In his 2004 book, A Wilderness So Immense, historian John Kukla described the city. By 1788, there were 5,338 people living within the wooden defenses of New Orleans. Earthworks surrounded by a palisade of vertical logs, with 4 raised bastions for cannon at the corners, and a 5th battlement in the middle of the north rampart, which faced towards Lake Pontchartrain. Within these walls stood 1,000 houses and buildings, most of brick, between post-construction and sheathed in wood or stucco. A few boasted roof tiles or slates, but most made do with wooden shingles. March 21st, 1788 was Good Friday. Don Jose Vicente de Nunez was the treasurer and paymaster of the army in the town, residing at the lower corner of Chartres and Toulouse streets. The New Orleans Times-Picayune wrote in 2018, "It was Good Friday, so of course a candle was burning in the Chartres Street home of Don Vicente Nunez, the military treasurer of the province." New Orleans had changed hands from the French to the Spanish 20 years earlier, but that didn't change its Catholic core. But Good Friday of 1788 turned out to be a bad Friday for New Orleans. That candle caught the drapes on fire in the Nunez home. Kukla quotes a report by a witness that was published in the London Chronicle. The 27-year-old paymaster was a zealous Catholic who, not satisfied with worshipping God in the usual way, had a chapel or altar erected in his house. At midday, he lit 50 or 60 wax tapers for Good Friday, as if his prayers could not ascend to heaven without them. The candles, being neglected at the hour of dinner, set fire to the ceiling. From thence proceeded the destruction of the most regular, well-governed, small city in the Western world. The timing of the fire could not have been worse. The people of the town would typically be warned of a fire by the ringing of church bells, but the website New Orleans Ghost notes, because it was Good Friday, the priest refused to allow the church bells to be used to alert the townsfolk. This included Père Antoine of the St. Louis Cathedral, which was destroyed in the fire. The public placed a lot of blame on Père Antoine for not ringing the church bells. The governor of Spanish Louisiana at the time was Esteban Miro. In his report to the Crown, he said of the fire, "A wind from the south, then blowing with fury, thwarted every effort to arrest its progress." An account by a witness published in a newspaper in Mexico said, "All the prompt and opportune aid and vigilance of the authorities were useless, including the fire apparatus, many of which were burnt by the flames." The wind-driven fire did its work quickly. New Orleans Ghost writes, "It took just 5 hours for the blaze to consume the city, destroying the prized homes of the city's wealthy socialites, business people, politicians, and generals." Miro wrote, 856 buildings were reduced to ashes, including all the business houses and principal mansions of the city. Recall that the entire city at the time numbered only around 1,100 buildings. Miro describes his efforts to preserve what he could. "As soon as we perceived that the progress of the fire was being hastened by unceasing gusts of wind and that the whole city was evidently in danger of destruction, our principal aim was directed towards the removal of our supply depot, as this was our sole dependence for future subsistence." A skilled administrator, Miro understood the risks the colony would face as the fire raged. "We had previously taken out of the artillery quarters every implement necessary to cut off the fire. We carried off from your treasury and deposited on the riverbanks all of your majesty's treasures, in currency and silver, over which a guard was kept, attended by that care against risk consequent of the confusion and disorder which necessarily occur at such a time. The papers belonging to the auditors and secretaries' departments were transferred to places of safety, and when subsequently returned to their respective custodians, none were found missing." While the fire destroyed some 4/5 of the structures in the city, Miro wrote that they had managed to save some important buildings, including the custom house, the tobacco warehouses, the governor's and intendant's buildings, the general supply store, provisions, and blankets for the Indians, our park of artillery, the Royal Hospital, the Ursulines Convent, the barracks set apart for the dragoons and resident regiment, and several private edifices fronting the river. Still, the buildings lost were among the most prominent in the city. The parochial church and presbytery were involved in the common disaster, together with the greater part of its archives. The municipal building, the barracks, and the armory, as well as the arms deposited there, except for 150 muskets, met the same fate. The public jail was destroyed, and hardly had we time to save the lives of the unfortunate prisoners." The governor lamented, "Such was the work of death, the result of 70 years of industry." While his report details the damage to the property of the crown, he was not at all callous to the suffering of the people. "If the imagination could describe what our senses enable us to feel from sight and touch, reason itself would recoil in horror, as it is no easy matter to say whether the sight of an entire city in flames was more horrible to behold than the suffering and pitiable condition in which everyone was involved. Mothers, in search of a sanctuary of refuge for their little ones and abandoning their earthly goods to the greed of the relentless enemy, would retire to out-of-the-way places rather than be witness of their utter ruin. Fathers and husbands were busy in saving whatever objects the rapidly spreading flames would permit them to bear off, while the general bewilderment was such as to prevent them from finding even these a place of security." As grim as the day of the fire seemed, Miro was more affected by the results the next day. The obscurity of the night coming on threw its mantle for a while over the saddening spectacle, but more horrible still was the sight, when day began to dawn, of entire families pouring forth into the public highways, yielding to their lamentations and despair, who but a few hours before had been basking in the enjoyment of more than the ordinary comforts of life. The tears, the heartbreaking sobs, and the pallid faces of these wretched people mirrored the dire fatality that had overcome a city, now in ruins, transformed within the space of 5 hours into an arid and fearful desert. Miro estimated that the total loss for the fire would be some 3 million pesos. But possibly the most extraordinary fact was that the fire, as devastating to the buildings and property of the community as it was, appeared to have cost only one life, a person who was unable to escape because she was sick. Had this unfortunate event happened in the small hours of the night, he noted, it would have cost many lives. Also extraordinary was the governor's response, in both the short and long term. Even as the fire raged, he planned for the victims of the fire. He wrote, "Hemmed in on every side by the raging flames, and mindful of the obligation we were under of extinguishing the conflagration and cutting off its further communications, we could not close our eyes to the dire necessity staring us in the face, a dearth of provisions for the morrow. On the spur of the moment, we took every measure suggested by humanity and our sense of duty to prevent the pangs of hunger from being added to the sufferings of the helpless victims of this terrible calamity. And with this object in view, I ordered that the stock of biscuits that had been rescued from the devouring element should be distributed among the needy applicants, inasmuch as most of the bakeries had been swept from existence. Many of the people rendered homeless were offered temporary lodging with families that were so fortunate as to escape unscathed. For the rest, some 700 according to Miro, they were housed in camping tents. He was able to report that, owing to the community's compassion, on the following day there was not a single human being without shelter, and the people whose property had been lost were given a daily ration of rice on your Majesty's account. Being a colony of the Crown, he used royal funds to prepare beyond the immediate crisis. One of my first measures was the sending of 3 ships to Philadelphia, directed to the care of our resident minister, besides the issuing of several permits to enable us, within the shortest possible delay, to receive a supply of provisions, nails, medicines, and other articles of first necessity at reasonable prices, for which purpose we draw from your royal coffers at this point the sum of $24,000 on account, for the payment of 3,000 barrels of flour, which I have already ordered. Moreover, he suggested to the king that trade restrictions be relaxed, allowing imports from any nation with a 3-year exemption on tariffs. The community pulled together, Miro explained. The people not embraced in this general misfortune have in general voluntarily offered to subscribe to a fund for the rebuilding of the edifices most needed. The ecclesiastical corps, represented by their vicar, has suppressed for the time being the collection of all parochial tithes. Colonel Maxent has exhibited all of this occasion evidences of the most considerate charity, having afforded a home and maintenance to a very large number of families who had sought a place of refuge at his residence. He sold me the stock of rice and tobacco that he had on hand at market prices rolling before the fire, and even offered to go up to the post Pointe Coupée for the purposes of getting the signatures of those who might be willing to subscribe for the relief of the needy. Put simply, Miro's action preserved the city. The Preservation Research Center of New Orleans writes, thanks to the leadership of Governor Miro, the provisioning of food and shelter to the homeless by the council, the fiscal generosity of private benefactor Don Andre Alaminister E. Rojas, and the easing of trade regulations, the city averted the shrinkage and divestment that sometimes follow urban traumas. In fact, the center continues, the disaster created occasion to expand the footprint of the ruined city. In 1788, a new subdivision was laid out in the adjacent Gravier Plantation as the Suburbio Santa Maria, later known as Faubourg Saint-Marie or St. Mary, and now the Central Business District. There 4 fire pumps being lost in the fire, the center notes that the response included one last request, as authorities requested from their superiors. 4 pumps, 60 leather buckets, 2 hooks with a chain, rope, and 6 hooks with long wooden handles. The Great New Orleans Fire of 1788 was a disaster by any standard, but the quick action of a competent government official and the compassion of its citizens prevented what could have been literally the city's demise. In fact, as the city's layout is the result of the destruction of the hurricane of 1722, much of the character of New Orleans today came as a result of the Great Fire. The Preservation Research Center explains, a construction boom ensued citywide, and that boom changed the city. The Times-Picayune notes, we still call it the French Quarter, but there's very little French about the architecture of New Orleans' oldest neighborhood. That's because of the fire of 1788. Buildings that are still important today were constructed in the wake of the fire, including St. Louis Cathedral and the Cabildo, then the home of the Spanish municipal government, and now the Louisiana State Museum. Governor Esteban Rodriguez Miro was one of the most popular of the territorial governors of Louisiana, not least because of his quick and compassionate response to the fire, but also for, later that year, quickly expelling a priest that had been appointed commissary of the Inquisition, thus preventing the Inquisition from coming to Louisiana. Miro returned to Spain in 1791 and served as a field marshal in the War of the Pyrenees. He died of natural causes while on campaign in 1795. Just 6 years after the Great Fire, in 1794, another 212 buildings were destroyed in another fire. Between the two fires, the early French architecture was almost wholly replaced by buildings in the Spanish style that still characterize the city's historic sections today. But the fire did more than change the city's architecture. It also helped to define the city's character, as the Times-Picayune notes. From the fires of 1788 and 1794 to 2005's Hurricane Katrina and the 2010 BP oil spill, New Orleans is a city familiar with disaster. But it is also familiar with picking itself up, dusting itself off, and persevering. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.